Aren't you glad you're a Christian? Okay, let's say last week's memory verse together. If you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. John 8:31 and 32. One night, these two guys were walking home after a party, and they decided to take a shortcut through a graveyard. Well, about halfway through that cemetery, they were startled by a tap, tap, tap sound. And so after stopping and nervously looking around, they spotted an old man with a hammer and chisel chipping away at a headstone. "Wow, mister," one of them said after catching his breath. "You scared us to death. We thought you were a ghost. What are you doing working here so late at night?" "Those idiots," the old man grumbled. "They misspelled my name." Halloween is known in America as a time to carve pumpkins, wear costumes, go door to door asking for candy, bob for apples, watch scary movies, and listen to radio stations play the Monster Mash. Oh, and listening to your preacher say bad Halloween jokes. Well, according to the History Channel, Americans spend an estimated $6 billion annually on Halloween, making it the country's second largest commercial holiday after Christmas. And according to this infographic from the National Retail Federation, they think it's actually going to be more than $8 billion this year. Well, through the years, I have heard and I have been asked quite a few questions about Halloween. Is Halloween anti-Christian? What about the origins of Halloween? Should I celebrate Halloween? Should I allow my kids to celebrate Halloween, etc.? And Christian perspectives on the observance of Halloween are strongly divided, because some feel complete freedom to observe the holiday, and they just consider the modern-day Halloween activities to be harmless fun. Some only participate in a few of the activities, and they avoid the ones that they think are wrong. Well, some simply ignore it and act as if it didn't exist, and others run and hide from it. And they believe that participating in Halloween in any way, shape, or form is involvement in evil and in darkness. And some will even say that it's Satan's birthday. There will no doubt be a few different perspectives in the audience. So today, I want to examine Halloween. How should a Christian respond to it? And I want to begin by looking at the arguments and the objections that are given by those who preach against Halloween. Now, I like to be thorough, so I'm going to give you I'm going to hit every one that I've ever heard, even the ones that I would consider to be a bit silly. So, objections to Halloween. The first one is gluttony. Now, of course, some health and bodybuilding websites object to Halloween because of nutrition, eating too much candy. But one person actually went so far as to say, Halloween is the epitome of all gluttony. Well, the Bible doesn't condemn eating a bunch of candy once a year, and I don't think that's what it's talking about when it refers to gluttony. If it is, then we're in trouble every potluck. At least I am. I think the Nelson's Bible Dictionary is probably correct. Glutton, a person who is debased and excessive in his or her eating habits. Gluttony is more than overeating. You see, it's more of a habit and a lifestyle. It has to do with a lack of self-control in that area. And as you know, the last aspect of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5 is self-control. But I don't think eating a bunch of Halloween candy once a year and going back for seconds during a potluck fits into that. Okay, maybe thirds, but no. Next, pet safety. I kid you not, I told you I was going to hit them all. Some animal lovers object to Halloween because of frightened pets. One website said, with people running around and so much activity, Cats and dogs get nervous, and some will take off if they can. And they also talk about pets eating candy and getting sick. And some are even afraid of occultists kidnapping their pets for animal sacrifices. I know some people secretly wish that they would take their neighbor's incessantly barking dog, but I digress. Well, the Bible doesn't address this. So if you're really concerned, just bring your animals in for the night. And then there's child safety. And some people express concerns about children cutting themselves while carving their pumpkins. I'm serious. Well, just carve it with them. Or, you can give them a child-safe knife. I get this picture in my mind of a little kid going after his pumpkin with a samurai sword or something. Or, well, they're concerned about kids getting hit by cars while trick-or-treating. And yes, children are 3 times more likely to suffer a pedestrian-related fatality on Halloween than any other night of the year. So, give them a good warning, and of course, go with them when they're younger. And you can even make sure that they have something reflective or something glowing on their costumes. There is also the concern about harmful things being put inside candy. And yes, it is extremely rare, but there have been stories of razor blades and needles or even arsenic or cyanide-laced candy. And I don't think we have to worry about that too much in Rolla, but you might as well be aware of it. I think in some states you have to worry more about marijuana candy. So, well, don't eat anything or let your kids eat anything that has loose or open wrappers. I know that some hospitals they'll even offer their x-ray machines for detecting foreign objects in the Halloween candy if you're really concerned. Children are indeed portrayed in Scripture as a gift from God. And I believe that we are stewards and that we are going to have to give an account for how we raised them, how we took care of them. And so we should definitely be aware and take any precautions necessary. But I don't see that as a reason to flat out reject Halloween. I mean, just driving to the church building is dangerous. Well, another argument is wild Halloween parties. And it is true that young adults, they often use Halloween as an excuse to revel in alcohol or immorality, 2 things that are clearly condemned in the Bible. Romans 13, verses 12 and 13. Let us therefore lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality. And listen to what Paul said, what he had to say to the churches of Galatia about the deeds of the flesh. Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these, of which I forewarn you, just as I have forewarned you, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. And so clearly, we need to stay away from worldliness during Halloween, just like we do at any other time. Drunkenness, fornication, other immoral behavior. That in itself doesn't necessarily mean that we need to boycott Halloween, but definitely make sure that you or your kids are not going to any wild parties. Or if the party gets wild, just leave. Ask the question, would I be comfortable taking Jesus to this particular party? Well, next, immodest costumes. And this is certainly getting more and more prevalent, especially with women's costumes. And we find passages like 1 Timothy 2:9. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly. And Proverbs 7:10 talks about the woman dressed as a harlot. So make sure your costume is modest. And probably don't hang out with a bunch of people in immodest costumes. Vandalism. No, I looked it up, and Halloween, it's traditionally the worst day of the year for vandalism. Young people, they will use Halloween as an excuse for vandalism. Some of them will. And I think that's what was meant by trick or treat, suggesting that some sort of prank or vandalism is going to be inflicted unless treats are provided. Egging or toilet papering houses is common, and kids will sometimes target schools, community buildings, and church buildings. And I've read before indoor plumbing was common. Tipping over or displacing outhouses was a popular form of Halloween vandalism. Some of the older folks in here, I see you're smirking. I suspect some of you did this back in the day. Andy in the first service reminded me of cow tipping, things like that. But sometimes, of course, it escalates, and it can cause some real problems with the vandalism. Well, it's definitely against the law. And besides the fact that Christians are to follow the laws of the land, Romans 13, Christians are to treat people the way they want to be treated, Matthew 7:12. Now, who wants their things damaged or to have to clean up a mess that they didn't make? So sure, talk to your kids about vandalism. But I don't think abuses are a reason to reject the holiday out of hand. I mean, anything can be abused. Horror films. All right, every year around Halloween, the movie industry releases a multitude of horror and slasher movies. And some people argue that these are getting worse, as it takes more to shock people these days. And these are often shown at Halloween parties. Well, obviously, this is not talking about all scary or suspenseful movies. But some Halloween movies and even some haunted houses are arguably desensitizing our children by their glorification of violence, gore, and death. They can become callous to these images and behaviors. And some people are worried that it's not only desensitizing them, but it can also promote sadism, or at least Schadenfreude. There's your word of the day. Obviously, it comes from German, and it's referring to getting pleasure from watching the suffering of others, like getting entertainment value from a slasher movie. Schadenfreude, say that 5 times fast. And it's debated, but from what I understand, there have been some studies showing that depictions of violence in movies and video games can lead to actual violent behavior in some children and teenagers. I think most of you would agree. It's probably not the best. Probably not so good for Christians to put a lot of that stuff in their heads. Psalm 101, verses 2 through 3, it says, "I will walk within my house in the integrity of my heart. I will set no worthless thing before my eyes." And the Hebrew word there for worthless could be translated as wicked or vile. Now, I don't know what David was referring to, what he had in mind there, but it could easily be argued that some of the stuff in horror films fits that. And Philippians 4:8 also comes to mind. "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, let your mind dwell on these things." As the old saying goes, what's down in the well comes up in the bucket. In other words, what is in the well of your thoughts will come up in the bucket of your actions. See, your heart makes decisions based on the material in your mind that it can draw from. And so that's why we need to control the avenues into our mind. What we see, what we hear, what we read. If we're just filling our minds with junk all the time, how can we expect to think wholesome thoughts and ultimately to make good decisions? And so ask the question, would I invite Jesus to see this particular movie with me? I just think we need to be careful. Now, I like war movies, and I like some scary movies. Yes, there's a big difference between a war movie and a slasher movie, but I still need to be careful. So, personally, I would say generally avoid those kinds of movies, especially if they're rated R, and even those gory or evil costumes based on those characters, based on blatantly evil characters. But not necessarily that we should avoid Halloween altogether. Okay, Pagan Background. Now we're getting into it a bit deeper. Now, I read that the celebration of Halloween was often forbidden among the early American colonists because of its background. And that's the reason why some Christians reject it today. And yes, it is true that Halloween is largely a recycled pagan celebration. I don't see any reason to hide it. Just look up Halloween in any encyclopedia. Here, I'll do it for you. As the Encarta Encyclopedia put it, many of the ancient peoples of Europe marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter by celebrating a holiday in late autumn. The most important of these holidays to influence later Halloween customs was Samhain. Now, it's actually pronounced more like Samhain, and it means summer's end. A holiday observed by the ancient Celts, a tribal people who inhabited most of Western and Central Europe in the first millennium BC. Samhain began at sundown on October 31st and extended into the following day. According to the Celtic pagan religion known as Druidism, the spirits of those who had died in the preceding year roamed the earth on Samhain evening. The Celts sought to ward off these spirits with offerings of food and drink. The Celts also built bonfires at sacred hilltop sites and performed rituals often involving human and animal sacrifices to honor Druid deities. And so what we find is that the ancient Celtic culture believed that on the evening of October 31st, well, the barriers between the human and the supernatural realms where they were weakened, and it was thought to be the most favorable time for divinations and fortune tellings, for the Druids to make predictions about the future. And I read that during the celebrations, they often wore costumes, and typically consisting of animal heads and animal skins. And that seems to be where the tradition of dressing up for Halloween came from. Well, I enjoy history. Let me just give you a little bit more. By AD 43, the Romans, they had conquered the majority of the Celtic territory, and the Romans, they then blended the local Samhain customs with their own pagan harvest festival honoring Pomona, the goddess of fruit trees. And some scholars suggest that that is where the game of bobbing for apples came from. Some believe that it was a form of divination, fortune telling, to learn about future marriages. See, the first person to bite an apple was predicted to be the first to marry in the coming year. And no, it doesn't actually work, because I think some of our college kids were starting to get excited. Well, then we find that it was brought over into Christianity. As the Encarta further says, the Roman Catholic Church often incorporated modified versions of older religious traditions in order to win converts. For example, Pope Gregory IV sought to replace Samhain with All Saints' Day in 835. All Souls' Day, closer in spirit to Samhain and modern Halloween, was first instituted at a French monastery in 998 and quickly spread throughout Europe. And so in an attempt to Christianize this pagan celebration with a church-sanctioned event, well, they moved their feast of All Saints' Day. Now that's a day to honor all of the saints of the church. They moved it from May 13th to November 1st, and November 2nd was later made All Souls' Day, which is a day to commemorate the rest of the departed. And so October 31st, it was set apart as this holy evening known as All Hallows' Eve. Hallows, speaking of the saints or holy ones, which of course then became Halloween. And then churches began staging pageants in which they would dress up as saints or demons. And that seems to have added to the dressing up tradition. Okay, trick-or-treating. Well, that most likely dates back to the All Souls' Day parades in England, known as going a-souling. And jack-o'-lanterns, well, they just came from this Irish folk tale about a man named Stingy Jack. And anyway, because of its background, some Christians will point to 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through 18, that says we're not to be bound together with unbelievers. And it says, "For what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Or what harmony has Christ with Belial? Or what has a believer in common with an unbeliever? Or what agreement has the temple of God with idols? And it also says to come out from their midst and be separate. And so they conclude that since Halloween has a pagan origin, we should not participate in it in any way, shape, or form. And I can respect that line of reasoning. I can. But I personally think that it falls more in line with 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 10. There were people in Corinth who had been converted out of paganism, these pagan religions where they worshipped idols and they ate meat that had been sacrificed to idols. And so many of them, they had a conscience when they came over to Christianity about eating meats sacrificed to idols. Well, 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, Paul, he had a lot of instructions on what you should do in regard to your conscience in that situation with regard to pagan origins. He explained that there's really nothing wrong with buying some meat in the marketplace, which may or may not have been sacrificed to an idol. It's just meat, and there's only one true God. It's not contaminated merely by its former association. But if you think it's wrong, then you shouldn't do it. So as you know, Romans 14, it also talks about not violating our conscience. Verse 23, but he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith, and whatever is not from faith is sin. Speaking of your personal conviction. And we are also to be careful. We're also told to be careful about not causing a brother or sister in Christ to violate his or her conscience. And so I think we should carry that over to Halloween. See, something to keep in mind is that there are all kinds of things that we are involved in today that have a pagan background. For instance, we use the term January in honor of the pagan god Janus. We use March in honor of the pagan god Mars. Sunday, the sun god. Monday, the moon god. Wednesday, Woden's day. Thursday, Thor's day. Saturday, Saturn's day. You see, we use the names, but we don't associate paganism with the days of the week or the months of the year. And consider the celebration of birthdays. See, from what I understand, in ancient Egypt, the birthdays of pharaohs were considered as holy days with no work being done. And because of that, some of the ancient Israelites, they thought it would be wrong for someone to celebrate a birthday. So, does that mean if I give my wife a present or if we have a birthday party for one of our kids that we've compromised our faith? You know, even wedding rings, they have a pagan origin from Egypt and Rome. And yet most Christian weddings today incorporate this tradition into the ceremony. See, a practice or a term may have originated under certain circumstances, but it has lost that significance, either in whole or at least significantly. See, practices, they can change with time, and they can mean different things to different people. To millions of Americans, Halloween is not celebrating Samhain or even All Hallows Eve. Yes, Halloween came from paganism, but it has turned for the most part into a national American holiday. See, from my perspective, I don't see any problem with celebrating it as that, a secular American holiday. Is there anything inherently wrong with carving a gourd? Is there anything inherently wrong with sticking your head in a bucket with water and apples? Is there anything inherently wrong with dressing up in costumes and getting a bunch of candy from your neighbors? I don't think so. In fact, the Bible tells us that God instructed the children of Israel to ask their neighbors for silver and gold during their last days in Egypt. Exodus 11:2, that's a very early version of trick or treat. See, it's biblical. Now, don't quote me on that. I'm just being silly. All right. Next, we've got NeoPagan observance. Now, this is true, and it may be the strongest argument. Halloween is a real sacred day for those who follow Wicca and other neo-pagan religions. So like the ancient Druids, they believe that it is the most magical night of the year. Mike Nichols, a NeoPagan, said this of Halloween: "A night of power when the veil that separates our world from the other world is at its thinnest. At no other holiday is a tarot card reading, crystal reading, or tea leaf reading so likely to succeed. To witches, Halloween is one of the 4 high holidays or great Sabbats or cross-quarter days. Because it is the most important holiday of the year, it is sometimes called the Great Sabbath." And so for that reason, there are some public schools that have attempted to abolish their Halloween parties and even their Halloween decorations on the grounds that it violates the separation of church and state. And some neo-pagans, they actually get offended at how lightly we treat their holiday. Well, as you know, in the past few decades, there has indeed been a resurgence of paganism and witchcraft in this country. And kids who would never involve themselves with the occult at any other time, well, they will sometimes experiment at a Halloween party with a seance or a Ouija board or something like that. And that is not a good idea. The Bible clearly condemns the occult. See, the spiritual implications of dabbling in it are extremely serious. In the Old Testament, we find passages like Deuteronomy 18. "There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, one who uses divination, or one who practices witchcraft, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who casts a spell, or one who calls up the dead. For whoever does these things is detestable to the Lord." You see, the Old Testament punishment for those in ancient Israel who did these things, it was actually death. And in the New Testament, you remember from Galatians 5, one of the deeds of the flesh was sorcery. In Revelation 21:8, it says, "But for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." And so definitely stay away from anything that is connected to the occult. Sorcery, casting spells, mediums, necromancy, magic, Ouija boards, fortune-telling, crystal balls, tarot cards, astrology, voodoo, seances, etc. But letting my kids dress up as a superhero or a Star Wars character and going trick-or-treating, it's certainly not that. All right, some things we should do. Let me give you some suggestions of things I believe we should do during this time of year. The first one is to be careful about judging your brother too quickly. So I believe celebrating Halloween as merely a cultural custom is a matter of personal judgment. Too often when Christians disagree, they quickly jump to judging one another at a level that is way above and beyond the level of disagreement. Because suddenly the other person is, well, they're talked about as if they are less of a Christian, or as, somehow less spiritual because they think differently. But people can have the same love for God as you and come to a different conclusion on a controversial subject. And Romans 14, which I would encourage you to read, it addresses this. You see, the Apostle Paul, he told us to accept one another even though we don't always agree in matters of opinion or judgment. And it's not talking about doctrine. There are things that are not revealed in the Word of God. There are a lot of specific things the Bible doesn't talk about. For example, there is no thou shalt or thou shalt not about Halloween. And so we're not to look down our noses at or condemn others for their opinions in these areas. Look, there's always going to be different opinions. There's always going to be different levels of knowledge among brethren. And to a certain extent, these must be accommodated for the sake of unity, of Christian unity. And these things are a matter of opinion. I'm not the judge. And they're not going to answer to me. They will answer to God. Romans 14:10. But you, why do you judge your brother? Or you again, why do you regard your brother with contempt? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of God. And like I said earlier, we can see from Romans 14 that a lot of it has to do with your conscience. So if you got a conscience against celebrating Halloween in any way, then you should not do it. But I don't believe we have a right to judge our brother in this regard. All right, next. Be determined to avoid anything sinful. We should definitely avoid anything that glorifies the occult, and probably that glorifies violence, gore, and death. We obviously need to stay away from vandalism. Quit going out cow tipping. And stay away from worldliness, drunkenness, immodest costumes, other immoral behavior. Also, let me drop this bomb while I'm flying over this area here. Halloween will sometimes land on a Sunday or a Wednesday. And I believe that it would be wrong to miss a Bible class or a worship assembly to go to a Halloween party or to go trick-or-treating. That says something to God about our priorities. I mean, why can't we just go after the worship or after the Bible class? We are told to seek first His kingdom and His righteousness in Matthew 6:33. And some people they even suggest using it as a soul-winning opportunity. See, it's an opportunity to meet your neighbors and maybe make some contacts there. And as long as candy is attached, trick-or-treaters, they're open to almost anything being placed in their containers, even gospel tracts. There are some Christian apologetic groups that they've actually made some cards that are designed for Halloween. And yes, some of them will end up on your lawn, I know from experience, but many of them will be taken home. So if it's got candy attached to it, it's a good bet they'll take it home. And of course, some congregations, they'll have a fall festival to try to make contacts in the community that way. So, what is my conclusion in all of this? Ultimately, Christians must decide for themselves and follow their own convictions regarding the observance of Halloween. Personally, as long as you're not calling forth the spirits of the dead or something like that, I think it's okay. But that's my personal conviction. My family carves pumpkins, we put innocent costumes on the kids, and we go trick-or-treating around the neighborhood. But we don't associate anything religious with it. And of course, we definitely try to avoid the things that I talked about. So, let's make sure to listen to our conscience, keep our brethren in mind, and always ask the question, what would Jesus do?